Hey there, hobby friends. I'm Jared, and this is Caffeinated Miniatures. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Recently, as I've been reading through more and more battle tomes and rules for Warhammer Age of Sigmar, and even, dare I say, lore, it's become all too apparent that there's a sharp difference in tone between the artwork and the lore, and the painted minis and the images we see. Although many of the painted minis shown to us are rather bright and clean in appearance, the lore, and in fact much of the artwork is, well, rather grim and dark. Obviously, I'm not the first person to suggest this. There are a great number of fantastic artists painting minis in a grim and dark style, or grimdark if you will. I bring this up because this was all circling my head as I was thinking about painting up Watch Captain Halgrim. Yes, the box art has a small amount of verdigris, but surely a mean, shambling, dead, or rather undead skeleton should be more beat up, grungy, and unsettling in appearance than that. I primed him up with black, fitting for a dark setting, and began painting the bones. Rather than the traditional warm ivory color, I went with a cool gray, trying to resemble cold, weathered bone. Working from a desaturated blue-gray, I built the shadows and highlights to a cool and similarly desaturated light gray. I will say that much of this model is near impossible to paint with a brush and saw rather little to no paint. As much of it was rather awkward to reach, the cloak was next, and as would be a running theme here, I started with dark sea blue. To create a dark, desaturated shadow color, I mixed in some black and slapped it across all of the cloth. Then, using the thin, scratchy brushstrokes I often use on cloth, I worked up to straight dark sea blue. Then adding some pale sand as I covered less and less surface. I settled on pale sand to brighten the blue as it added some warmth and interest without making it too worn looking. I quite liked the warm, bright metal around the collar on the box art. It helps bring the eye to the center of the model and the face. Or skull, as it were. I mixed together some black, red, and light rust, covering all but the deepest shadow areas. Then mixing in some yellow, I built up the highlights. Finally adding some ivory for the brightest points of light. While listing colors in this way may seem the process seem very linear, I assure you it is not. I go back and forth between different hues until I'm fairly happy with the light and the shadows. And I was pretty sure I'd end up adding some verdigris, but decided to get some paint on the rest of the armor first. I picked a few pieces of armor and began working on the placement of light. Starting with a mix of neutral gray and black, I focused on where the brightest places would be, edges and reflections. I then built these points of light up to pale gray. Finally adding some white to the pale gray for the brightest or shiniest points. At this point, I figured it was time to figure out some oxidization, some rust. I realize there are plenty of great one-step rust products on the market, but that's just not fun to me. As I often do, when looking for some color inspiration, I took to the real world. Well, not the real world. I went to Google, looking at photos of rusted steel. With some inspiration in mind, I found a couple of my paints that I thought would work. Black, red, and a bit of an obvious choice, light rust. Starting with a highly diluted black red, I glazed in some of the darker rust undertones. And after a couple of layers, I repeated this process with the light rust. focusing on the areas where the rust might be more intense or built up. Going back to the rest of the armor, I decided to work in the reverse of the first few sections, starting by glazing in some rust color as before, only in a much sloppier manner, covering more of the surface than would actually end up looking rusty. Then picking out the brighter, shinier bits, just as I had on the first sections, black and neutral gray, neutral gray, pale gray, and white. Satisfied with how the rust was looking, I moved back to the bronzy yellowy armor and some verdigris. After once again popping over to Google for some color inspiration, I began mixing some turquoise and golden yellow until I had something approximating the verdigris images I saw. I opted for a glaze consistency here as well, as I felt it afforded me a little more control over the intensity in any given spot. More layers equals more intensity. Fewer layers and, well, you get the picture. Feeling fairly happy with the armor, I moved on to some more armor. The dangling coins. Or chainmail, I guess, but it definitely looks like coins. Regardless, as I wanted to make this a bronzy metal, I started by smearing on the verdigris color I had previously mixed. Then flowed through the same orange and yellow colors as before. Next up, the weapons. After painting the contrasting warm rust and cool shiny bits on the armor, I felt like I hit my stride here with the polearm, spear, axe head thing. After glazing on the black red, I focused more of the light rust into the pockmarks. After painting the axe edge black, I sketched in some light with a mix of dark sea blue and gray, making sure I left some of the black showing to really emphasize the contrast. Whereas I did very little glazing between layers on the armor, I made sure to glaze between each step here, quickly blending in each progressive bump in brightness. I used snow blue and white for the brightest points of light here. Adding more blue pumped up the contrast, making it appear that much brighter, and also sharp, against the warm rust color. Then follow the same process on the sword, knock out the remaining details, and all that remained was the base. As I tend to do, this was a combination of slopping on some contrast paint, some highlights, and some dry brushing. Couple of grass tufts for good measure, and here we are. there you go, a more subdued and rusty paint scheme. Something a little more in line with the tone of the story. Don't get me wrong, I don't think this is a particularly grim, dark paint job, as you could certainly make it a whole lot more grim and dark. However, I do kind of like it. Now I do want to know, do you prefer to paint more grim and dark, or do you prefer that kind of clean and crisp look? Let me know in the comments below. As always, if you made it this far, you are an absolute legend. While you're here, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. You are awesome. And I'll see you in the next one.